The M3 Stuart, a formerly light tank M3, is an American light tank of World War II. It was supplied to British and Commonwealth forces under lend-lease prior to the entry of the U.S. into the war. Thereafter, it was used by U.S. and Allied forces until the end of the war. The name General Stuart, a Stuart given by the British, comes from the American Civil War Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart and was used for both the M3 and the derivative M5 light tank. In British service, it also had the unofficial nickname of Honey after a tank driver remarked, "She's a honey." To the United States Army, the tanks were officially known only as Light Tank M3 and Light Tank M5. The M3 Stuarts were the first American crude tanks in World War II to engage the enemy in tank versus tank combat. Development. Observing events in Europe, American tank designers realized that the light tank M2 was becoming obsolete and set about improving it. The upgraded design, with thicker armor, modified suspension, and new gun recoil system, was called Light Tank M3. Production of the vehicle started in March 1941 and continued until October 1943. Like its direct predecessor, the M2A4, the M3 was initially armed with a 37mm M5 gun and 5.30-06 Browning M1919A4 machine guns, coaxial with the gun on top of the turret in an M20 anti-aircraft mount, in a ball mount in right bow and in the right and left hull sponsons. Later, the gun was replaced with the slightly longer M6, and the sponson machine guns were removed. For a light tank, the Stuart was fairly heavily armored. It had 38mm of armor on the hull front, 44mm on the hull bottom, 51mm on the gun mantlet, 38mm on the turret sides, 25mm on the hull sides, and 25mm on the hull rear. Internally, the radial engine was at the rear and the transmission to the driving sprockets at the front. The prop shaft connecting the two ran through the middle of the fighting compartment. The radial engine compounded the problem, having its crankshaft high off the hull bottom. When a turret floor was introduced, the crew had less room. The rear idler sprocket was moved to a trailing position. M5 Stuart relieved the demand for the radial aero engines used in the M3. A new version was developed using twin Cadillac V8 automobile engines and twin hydromatic transmissions operating through a transfer case. This variation was quieter, cooler, and roomier. Owing to its automatic transmission, it also simplified crew training. The new model also featured a redesigned hull with sloped glacis plate and driver's hatches moved to the top. Although the main criticism from the units using it was that the Stuarts lacked firepower, the improved M5 series kept the same 37mm gun. The M5 gradually replaced the M3 in production from 1942, and after the M7 project proved unsatisfactory, was succeeded by the light tank M24 in 1944. Combat history. War in North Africa and Europe. The British Army was the first to use the light tank M3 as the General Stuart in combat. From mid-November 1941 to the end of the year, about 170 Stuarts took part in Operation Crusader during the North Africa campaign, with poor results. This is despite the fact that the M3 was superior or comparable in most regards to most of the tanks used by the Axis forces. The most numerous German tank, the Panzer III USFG, had nearly identical armor and speed to the M3, and both tanks' guns could penetrate the other tank's front armor from beyond 1,000 meters. The most numerous Italian tank, the Fiat M1340, was was much slower than the Stuart, had slightly weaker armor all around, and could not penetrate the Stuart's front hull turret armor at 1,000 meters, where the Stuart's gun could penetrate any spot on the M1340. Although the high losses suffered by Stuart-equipped units during the operation had more to do with the better tactics and training of the Afrika Korps than the apparent superiority of German armored fighting vehicles used in the North African campaign, the operation revealed that the M3 had several technical faults. Mentioned in the British complaints were the 37mm M5 gun and poor internal layout. The two-man turret crew was a significant weakness, and some British units tried to fight with three-man turret crews. The Stuart also had a limited range, which was a severe problem in the highly mobile desert warfare, as units often outpaced their supplies and were stranded when they ran out of fuel. On the positive side, crews liked its relatively high speed and mechanical reliability, especially compared to the Crusader tank, which comprised a large portion of the British tank force in Africa up until 1942. The Crusader had similar armament and armor to the Stuart while being slower, less reliable, and several tons heavier. The Stuart also had the advantage of a gun that could deliver high explosive shells. For the QF2PDR mounted by most Crusaders, He shells were not available, severely limiting the use against infantry. The main drawback of the Stuart was its low fuel capacity and range. Its operational range was only 75 miles, roughly half that of the Crusader. In the summer of 1942, the British usually kept Stuarts out of tank-to-tank combat, using them primarily for reconnaissance. The turret was removed from some examples to save weight and improve speed and range. These became known as Stuart Recce. Some others were converted to armored personnel carriers known as the Stuart Kangaroo, and some were converted command vehicles and known as Stuart Command. M3S, M3A3S, and M5S continued in British service until the end of the war, but British units had a smaller proportion of these light tanks than U.S. units. The other major lend-lease recipient of the M3, the Soviet Union, was less happy with the tank, considering it undergunned, underarmored, likely to catch fire, and too sensitive to fuel quality. The M3's radial aircraft engine required high-octane fuel, which complicated Soviet logistics as most of the tanks used diesel or low-octane fuel. High fuel consumption led to a poor range characteristic, especially sensitive for reconnaissance vehicle. Also, compared to Soviet tanks, the M3's narrower tracks resulted in a higher ground pressure, getting them more easily stuck in the spring and autumn mud and winter snow conditions on the Eastern Front. In 1943, the Red Army tried out the M5 and decided that the upgraded design was not much better than the M3. Being less desperate than in 1941, the Soviets turned down an American offer to supply the M5. M3s continued in Red Army service at least until 1944. War in the Far East, CBI and Pacific. The U.S. Army initially deployed 108 Stuart light tanks to the Philippines in September 1941, equipping the U.S. Army's 194th and 192nd Tank Battalions. The first U.S. tank versus tank combat to occur in World War II began on the 22nd of December 1941, when a platoon of 5 M3s led by Lieutenant Ben R. Moran engaged the Imperial Japanese Army 4th Tank Regiment's Type 95 Hargo light tanks north of Damotas. Lt. Moran maneuvered his M3 off the road but took a direct hit while doing so, and his tank began to burn. The other 4 M3s were also hit but managed to leave the field under their own power. Lt. Moran was wounded, and he and his crew were captured by the enemy. M3s of the 194th and 192nd Tank Battalions continued to skirmish with the 4th Tank Regiment's tanks as they continued the retreat down the Bataan Peninsula, with the last tank versus tank combat occurring on the 7th of April 1942. Due to the naval nature of the Pacific Campaign, steel for warship production took precedence over tanks for the IJA, creating by default an IJA light tank that performed admirably in the jungle terrain of the South Pacific. By the same measure, although the U.S. was not hampered by industrial restrictions, the U.S. M3 light tank proved to be an effective armored vehicle for fighting in jungle environments. At least one was captured in the Philippines, with the IJA's drive toward India within the Southeast Asian theater of World War II. The United Kingdom hastily withdrew the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment and 7th Hussars Stuart tank units from North Africa, and deployed them against the Japanese 14th Tank Regiment. By the time the Japanese had been stopped at Imphal, only one British Stuart remained operational. When the U.S. entered the war in 1941, it began to supply China with AFVs including the M3 Stuarts, and later M4 Shermans and M18 Hellcats, which trickled in through Burma and formed part of the several well-equipped, well-trained armies that the Chinese nationalists could deploy. These units were responsible for stopping numerous Japanese attacks during the later phases of the war. Although the U.S. light tanks had proven effective in jungle warfare, by late 1943, U.S. Marine Corps tank battalions were transitioning from their M3, M5 light tanks to M4 medium tanks, with the less common supplement of the Type 97 Kaiha medium tanks. The IJA was left to do battle against U.S. Marine M4 Sherman medium tanks, with armor that had been designed and fielded in the 1930s. Usage when the U.S. Army joined the North African campaign in late 1942, Stuart units still formed a large part of its armor strength. After the disastrous Battle of Kasserine Pass, the U.S. quickly followed the British in disbanding most of the light tank battalions and subordinating the Stuarts to medium tank battalions performing the traditional cavalry missions of scouting and screening. For the rest of the war, most U.S. tank battalions had 3 companies of M4 Shermans and 1 company of M3s or M5A1s. In Europe, Allied light tanks had to be given cavalry and infantry fire support roles since the main cannon armament could not compete with heavier enemy armored fighting vehicles. However, the Stuart was still effective in combat in the Pacific theater, as Japanese tanks were both relatively rare and were lighter in armor than even Allied light tanks. Japanese infantrymen were not well equipped with anti-tank weapons, and as such had to use close assault tactics. In this environment, the Stuart was only moderately more vulnerable than medium tanks. In addition, the terrain and poor roads common to the theater were unsuitable for the much heavier M4 medium tanks, and so initially, for both sides, it was advantageous to deploy light armor. Heavier M4s were eventually brought to overcome heavily entrenched positions, though the Stuart continued to serve in a combat capacity until the end of the war, though the Stuart was to be completely replaced by the newer M24 Chaffee. The number of M3s, M5s produced was so great that the tank remained in service until the end of the war, and well after. In addition to the UK and Soviet Union, who were the primary users. It was also used by France, China and Josip Broz Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. Post-World War II use. After the war, some countries chose to equip their armies with cheap and reliable war surplus Stuarts. The Chinese Nationalist Army, having suffered great attrition as a result of the ensuing civil war, rebuilt their armored forces by acquiring surplus vehicles left behind in the Philippines by the U.S. forces, including 21 M5A1s to equip 2 tank companies. They would have the finest hours during the Battle of Kooning-to in 1949, for which the tanks came to be known as the Bear of Kinmen. The M5 played a significant role in the First Kashmir War between India and Pakistan, including the Battle of Zojila Pass, fought at an elevation of nearly 12,000 feet. The vehicle remained in service in several South American countries at least until 1996. M3A3s were used by British forces in Indonesia during the Indonesian National Revolution, where they suffered heavy losses due to the Stuarts' thin armour plating. They were used until 1946, when the British left. The M3A3s were then passed on to the KNIL, which used them until the end of the fighting before passing on the tanks to the Indonesian National Army. The tanks saw action during the Dai-T rebellions in Aceh and Java, RMS rebellions in South Maluku's PRRI rebellions in Sumatra, Pemesta rebellions in northern Sulawesi, and the fighting against the 30th of September movement. During the 1960s and 1970s, the Portuguese army also used some in the war in Angola, where its all-terrain capability was greatly appreciated. In 1967, the Portuguese army deployed 3 M5A1 light tanks, nicknamed Milocas, Licas, and Gina by the Crows, in northern Angola, which served with the 1927th Cavalry Battalion commanded by Cavalry Major João Mendes Paulo, stationed at Nambiwa and Ongo. The vehicles were mostly employed for convoy escort and recovery duties, and limited counterinsurgency operations against National Liberation Front of Angola guerrillas, who dubbed them Elefante Dundum. Milocas was destroyed by an accidental fire in 1969, while Gina and Licas were withdrawn from active service in 1972, the former being sent to Luanda and the latter ended up in 1973 as an airfield security pillbox in the Portuguese Air Force's Sala airfield. Period photographs show some modifications to the basic design, namely the omission of the bow machine gun, reinstalled on a pintle mount in the roof of the turret, and a small searchlight fitted in front of the commander's cupola. During the Football War, El Salvador invaded Honduras in an all-out war strike using the M3 Stuart as the main battle tank. The use of the Stuart will prove success to El Salvador Army because of the rough terrain and the agility the vehicles have. El Salvador captured 8 major cities with the help of Stuarts. The South African Armored Corps continued to use M3A1s in a reserve role until 1955. Some were refurbished locally in 1962 and remained in service as late as 1964. The fleet was withdrawn in 1968. Owing to parts shortage, the M3 Stuart is still on the active list in the Armed Forces of Paraguay, with 10 of the tanks being overhauled in 2014 to provide a training capability. Variants: U.S. variants M3, 5,811 vehicles were produced. 1,285 M3s had Gibson diesel installed and were called Stuart II by British. Late production M3s were fitted with turret developed for M3A1, though without turret basket. These tanks were dubbed Stuart Hybrid. M3A1, 4,621 were produced from May 1942 to February 1943. New turret with turret basket and no cupola. Gun vertical stabilizer installed. Sponson machine guns were removed. M3A1s with Gibson diesel were called Stuart IV by British. M3A3, 3,427 produced, put into production to integrate hull improvements brought by the M5 into the M3 series. Turret with rear overhang to house -508 Seychelles rupees radio. Welded hull with sloped armor, 20 degrees in from the vertical on front and sides. M5, 2075 produced. Twin Cadillac engines. Redesigned hull similar to M3A3, but with vertical sides and raised engine deck. Turret is for M3A1. M5A1, 6,810 produced. M5 with the turret of the M3A3. This was the major variant in U.S. units by 1943. 75mm howitzer motor carriage M8, 1,778 units produced. Based on M5 chassis, the gun was replaced with the 75mm M2, M3 howitzer in open turret on a trailer hook was fitted so an ammunition trailer could be towed. Provided fire support to cavalry reconnaissance squadrons. 75mm howitzer motor carriage M8A1. M8 HMC variant based on M5A1 chassis. T18 75mm howitzer motor carriage. Self-propelled gun based on M3 chassis. 75mm M1A1 pack howitzer was mounted in a boxy superstructure. The project started in September 1941 and was abandoned in April 1942. Only two were produced. 75mm howitzer motor carriage M8 was chosen to be produced instead. T-82 howitzer motor carriage, self-propelled 105mm howitzer based on M5A1 chassis. Development began in 1943. Two prototypes built and tested in August 1944 at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Project was discontinued on June 21, 1945. T-56 3" gun motor carriage. Self-propelled gun based on M3A3 chassis. The engine was moved to the middle of the hull and a 3" gun was mounted in a superstructure in the rear. The project started in September 1942 and was abandoned in February 1943. T-57 3" gun motor carriage, variant of T-56 with Continental engine of the medium tank M3. Also dropped in February 1943. T-27, T-27E 181mm mortar motor carriage, M5A1 with turret replaced by superstructure in which an 81mm mortar was installed. Also carried 50 cal Browning M2 HB machine gun. The project was abandoned in April 1944 because of inadequate crew and storage space. T-29 4.2" mortar motor carriage, design similar to T-27 with 4.2" mortar, was abandoned for the same reason. T-81 chemical mortar motor carriage, M5A1 based 4.2" chemical mortar carrier, M3 with Maxim turret, anti-aircraft variant developed in 1942, was armed with four 50 cal machine guns in a turret developed by Maxim Corp. The project was rejected because of the availability of the M16 MG/MC 40mm gun motor carriage T-65, anti-aircraft vehicle based on length and M5A1, was armed with Bofors 40mm gun, was ordered into production, but on light tank M24 chassis, so became the M19 gun motor carriage, 20mm multiple gun motor carriage T-85. Anti-aircraft vehicle based on same chassis as T-65. Was armed with quad-Lycon 20mm cannons, M3, M5 command tank, M3, M5 with turret replaced by small superstructure with a 50 cal machine gun, T8 reconnaissance vehicle, M5 with turret removed and mounting for 50 cal machine gun, M3 with T2 light mine exploder. Developed in 1942, was rejected. M3, M3A1 with Satan flame gun. Ronson flamethrower installed instead of the main gun. 20 tanks were converted for U.S. Marine Corps in 1943. M5A1 with E5R1 M3 flame gun. Flamethrower was installed instead of the hull machine gun. M3A1 with E5R2 M3 flame gun. Flamethrower was installed in place of hull machine gun. M5 dozer. M5 with dozer blade. Turret was usually removed. M5 with T-39 rocket launcher. T-39 launcher with 27.2 rockets mounted on the top of the turret. Never reached production. M5A1 with E7-7 flame gun. Flamethrower was installed instead of the main gun. M5A1 with E9-9 flame-throwing equipment. Prototype only. M5A1 with the 8 flame gun, turret replaced by boxy superstructure with flamethrower in a smaller turret. Prototype only. UK variant Stuart Recce, reconnaissance vehicle based on turretless Stuart. Stuart Command. Stuart Kangaroo with extra radios. Stuart artillery tractor, another turretless variant similar in appearance to the Recce and Kangaroo. Used to tow the ordnance QF 17-pounder, not to be confused with the US M5 tractor, Brazilian variants. In the 1970s, the Brazilian company Bernardini developed a series of radical Stuart upgrades for the Brazilian Army. X1A, based on M3A1. This design had new engine subs, Scania diesel, improved suspension, new upper hull armor, fire controls and DEF a 90mm gun in a new turret. 80 vehicles were produced, X1A1, and X1A with improved suspension with 3 bogies each side and raised idler. Didn't reach production. X1A2, based on the X1A1. This version retained almost nothing of the original Stuart as even its hull was redesigned. The vehicle weighed 19 short tons, had crew of 3, was armed with 90mm gun and powered by Scania 300 horsepower diesel. 30 vehicles were produced in 1979 to 1983. Operators: Australia, Belgium, Brazil, 350 M3A3A5. Canada, Stuart V tanks were widely used in Recce Troop of Armoured Regiments, in 2 Canadian Armoured Brigade after the Normandy landings. The establishment for each regiment was 49 Sherman tanks, both 75mm and 17 PDR, and up to 9 Stuart tanks. Chile, People's Republic of China captured from Chinese Civil War. Republic of China, Colombia, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, France, Haiti, 8 M3A1 and 5 M5A1. Hungary captured at least 3 from the Soviets. India, Indonesia, M5A1 from Netherlands. Italy, Japan, operated captured vehicles, for example in the Philippines and at the Battle of Imphal. Mexico, Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, 4 M3A1 still in service with the National Guard in 1979. Paraguay, 12 still in service, 5 are operational in 2 RC 2010. Philippines, used by the Philippine Army and Philippine Constabulary from 1941 to 1959. Portugal, 70 vehicles in service with the Portuguese Army and other 20 with the Republican National Guard from 1956 to 1972. South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, Turkey, United Kingdom, Uruguay, United States, Soviet Union. 1,676 M3 series tanks received as part of lend-lease, and 5 M5. Venezuela, Yugoslavia. In the media, the 1941 U.S. military propaganda short film The Tanks Are Coming features the M3 and its manufacturing process. In the 1945 Mexican film comedy Un Dia con el Diablo, several Mexican Army M3s appear. One of them is driven by the comic actor Mario Moreno. Cantinflas. Modified Stuarts were used in the movie Attack as German tanks. An M3 Stuart tank was the centerpiece of the Green Hornet episode Seek, Stalk, and Amp, Destroy. A 24K gold M3 Stuart tank was created from gold bullion with plans stolen from the Hexagon in Batman episode Penguin's Disastrous End. It was stopped with the Bazooka. Season 5 of the Twilight Zone TV series had an episode. The 7th is made up of Phantoms, featuring an M3 Stuart tank and its crew going back in time, fighting the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Haunted Tank was a DC Comics feature that appeared in G.I. Combat, starring an M3 Stuart scout tank commanded by Lieutenant Jeb Stuart, a direct descendant and namesake of the Civil War cavalry General J.E.B. Stuart. The tank was haunted by the Confederate officer, who would appear to warn his kinsmen of impending danger or offer advice on how to handle a combat action. The original series ran from 1961 to 1987. A heavily modified M5A1 Stuart was featured in the movie Tank Girl as the eponymous heroine's tank. A M5A1 Stuart tank was featured in the James Bond movie License to Kill. The tank opens fire on the Chinese hideout in the fictional country Isthmus and saves Bond.